A retired rancher had lived alone for years when 5 beautiful but exhausted Apache widows arrived and begged him to let them stay on his ranch. Before we begin, please like the video and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. At the end of November 1882, the wind brought frost earlier than usual. High in the Silver Buds Hills in Colorado, Reed Callahan had already covered the windows with oilcloth and stacked the final loads of firewood. He wasn't expecting visitors. He never was. The nearest town was almost 20 kilometers away, down a rocky, snowy road. His closest neighbor had died in the spring. 6 years earlier, Reed had built the cabin firmly into the hillside with his own hands when he decided to leave the company of men behind and stay with his animals. Reed was 32 years old. Before devoting himself fully to the ranch, he had worked as an interpreter. He was fluent in Spanish and Comanche, and the authorities hired him when they wanted to reach agreements without bloodshed. But he saw blood anyway, too much of it. He witnessed young women falling under tangled bullets, children being torn away and loaded onto carts, and old people lying on the ground, barely covered by their blankets. When he tried to speak, no one wanted to listen, so he left. Since then, silence had been his only companion. That afternoon, he was splitting thick, damp spruce logs behind the cabin. His gloves were torn at the fingertips, and there was a crack in the left heel of his boots. He chopped steadily, not for exercise or distraction, but because winter would be long and the fire would burn fast. A pot was boiling on the stove, and a piece of goat meat was waiting to be stewed, when the silence was broken. It wasn't the wind, the sound was steady. Reed stopped in the middle of a blow and listened. Footsteps, several, light, cautious, human. He walked around the side of the cabin, keeping his hand close to the revolver on his belt, but not taking it out yet. As he turned towards the porch and past some split logs, he saw 5 women standing at the edge of the clearing, surrounded by snow-covered undergrowth. They had no horses or cart, only their feet were reddened by the cold. Wrapped in rags, they wore dresses that had once been made of leather or cotton. Now they were patched, torn and hardened by frost. They wore blankets that hung from their shoulders and barely covered what remained of their modesty. The one in front was full-bodied, with dark hair tied back with a sinew bow. She took a step forward, her mouth dry but her gaze steady. Reed didn't move. The woman didn't beg. She spoke directly. "We need a place, just one night. We ask for nothing more than that." He looked at her, then behind her. He could see what she wasn't saying. The younger woman had a trail of blood running down her thigh. The taller woman was holding her arm as if it were dislocated. Another woman carried only a small cloth bag. They weren't wanderers, they were survivors. Reed looked towards the trees behind him. Nothing moved. There were no patrols or horsemen. He remembered the last time he had let someone in.
3 years ago, a trapper, fleeing debt, had drunk his supplies, stolen his best horse, and left it tied up in the barn for a day and a half. But these weren't men. They were Apache widows. You could tell by their posture, proud and half wild, but not defeated, just worn down. Ray opened the gate and said nothing. They entered one by one, slowly, watching him as they passed. He could smell blood and pine needles on their clothes. One of them was older than the others. She was tall, with wide hips, and wrinkles rippled across her face. He didn't thank her at the time. Inside, the fire was already low. Ray threw another log on the fire, stirred the pot, and took a bowl from the shelf. He served the remaining stew from the previous night, thick with roots and meat, and passed the bowls without comment. They settled in a circle near the fire. The woman who had spoken remained on her knees, her palms extended towards the heat. Her dress was torn across her chest. Ray noticed the cut. It had been stitched up once before, but the wound had reopened. The sun-baked skin beneath was damp with cold sweat. She didn't hide it or seem to care. Ray's throat tightened. It wasn't desire or shame, but anger. Who had done this to her? Trembling, the youngest, Tala, though Ray didn't know her name yet, drank. She made no noise and did not cry. She just swallowed silently with her eyes open, looking exhausted. They had not come in search of alms. They came because there was nowhere else to go. After dinner, Ray gave them some folded woolen blankets. He did not ask their names or try to make conversation. That is not how you gain the trust of people who have been persecuted. He took a couple of extra cots out of a trunk and set them up next to the stove. The floor was hard, but warmer than outside. He placed the last blanket near Cyan. She looked up at him fearlessly, assessing him. Her eyes scanned his face, his posture, and his belt. She knew he was armed and lived alone, and that he could do whatever he wanted. But he didn't. Instead, he simply moved away and sat by the window, with the rifle on his lap, watching the darkness in case someone had followed them. Behind him, he could hear them settling in. One of them began whispering softly and haltingly. Another let out a brief, low laugh. Cyan replied, and then there was silence. It sounded like home, or at least a memory of it. He didn't sleep that night, not properly. He watched the door and listened to the crackling of the firewood, trying not to think about the fact that 5 strangers had entered his home, and he wasn't afraid. No, it was really something else. Responsibility. It sat heavily on his chest, like the snow on the roof, yet he didn't send them away. The morning arrived quietly and sharply. Ray was already awake before the sun rose over the mountains. He had slept in his chair, boots on, rifle on lap. His neck hurt, but he didn't stretch. First, he listened.
Inside, the 5 others were still asleep, wrapped in blankets and breathing evenly as the fire burned down to embers. One of them, who had a high-pitched voice and the gaze of a hawk, was lying by the door as if on guard duty. The youngest was curled up, her face buried in her arms. The others were lying on the floor among the wool and rags they had brought with them. He put down his rifle and went to the stove. He lit the fire slowly and carefully, then added water to the pot. His hands moved without thinking, a habit older than fear. When the first light stained the boards, Sane sat up on one elbow, her hair loose around her neck. Her crumpled chamois dress was still torn at the chest. She did not cover herself. She looked at him without shyness or insinuation. She was simply taking him in. He held her gaze and nodded briefly. She got up. They didn't speak. Rid handed her a can of coffee. She understood, measuring up the portions without asking. By the time the others woke up, the cabin was filled with the aroma of coffee. Steam rose from the cups like winter breath. Once again they ate goat stew. No one complained, not even the youngest. After breakfast, Sane left without saying a word. The others followed her. Rit stayed behind and let the door close. She watched them from the window. They moved with purpose. Sane checked on the Sylv goats to see how they were responding. Meanwhile, Kaya picked up a torn blanket from the railing and sat down to mend it. Paya circled the cabin, watching the hills as if waiting for someone. Meanwhile, Noli dragged a bucket to the well of her own accord. Tala stood with her hands over her mouth, breathing out warm air into the cold. They weren't guests, they were survivors. And survivors don't stand still. Rit went out and started chopping wood again. Sane joined him shortly afterwards. She didn't ask for permission, she just picked up splinters and stacked them against the wall. He moved slowly and painfully, but stubbornly. Her dress clung to her legs as she bent down. The snow wet the fabric. The side opening was wider than she realized, showing more skin than she intended. Or maybe she did realize, but Sine never turned to see if he was looking at her. She didn't need to. Noon arrived. The sun barely warmed the earth, but it melted the frost from the roof. Inside, Rid took out what little remained.
Flour, salt, butter, and a piece of dried meat. He sat at the table and watched Noli and Callahan cook. One kneaded while the other cleaned the surface. There was no conversation, just rhythm. He leaned back with his arms crossed. Questions piled up. Who were they? Where did they come from? Why now? He didn't voice them, but in the afternoon, Sane finally said something while standing in the doorway and watching the others work. "We come from below Fort Garland," she said. "There was an assault. Some drunken white ranchers thought we were hiding warriors." She looked him in the eye. It wasn't true. Rid remained silent. He just stared at her face, marked by the years. Her neck was covered in old scratches. "Most of us lost our men months ago," she continued, "but they don't care. Widow or not, they take what they want." Reed didn't respond right away. There was no pity on his face, only understanding. "They burned our shelter," she said. "They took what little we had. We walked for 5 days." Reed looked down. 5 days in that snow. Sayan took another step inside, still without shoes. "We saw your smoke. From the hill we thought that only a man lived here, but we wouldn't have risked it otherwise." He looked at her for a few seconds. "Did you guess right?" he replied. She smiled slightly, then wiped it away. "We won't stay long," she said. "Just long enough to get back on our feet." Reed didn't answer. That afternoon he took some extra tools out of the shed, another axe, nails, and rope. He didn't explain anything. He just left them there until nightfall. Peya had already repaired the back door. Kea mended a torn curtain. Noli adjusted the lock. Reed found himself on the porch with a coffee, watching them move around as if they had always belonged there. None of them asked what he expected of them. None of them followed rules. Sayan walked past him into the house. Her hip brushed his knee. It wasn't an accident, but it wasn't entirely intentional either. Their eyes met again. That night, the 5 of them slept inside. The blankets were arranged closer to the stove. Taylor curled up next to Kella. Peya stayed at the entrance, arms crossed over her chest. Noli lay on her back. Her eyes were open in the darkness. Sayan took the far end, near the chair where Reed had sat down. She didn't fall asleep right away. She lay on her side, looking at him. "I know what men expect," she murmured. Reed said nothing. "I know what people will say if we stay too long." He remained silent. She examined his face, the scar next to his eye and the stiffness in his shoulders. Nodding to herself, she turned away. Reed remained for a long time, looking first at the door, then at the fire, and finally at her silhouette under the blanket. For the first time in years, he did not feel as though he were watching over something. He felt as though he belonged, and he did not want to send them away. That night, the snow fell heavily, blanketing the earth in white silence. The next morning, everything outside was still. No wind, no footprints, no noise. Just piles of snow and a low gray sky that would not yield. Inside, the air felt warm but stuffy. The fire had burned out. The smell of boiled coffee lingered, and the wood crackled softly. No one spoke yet. Reed was at the table, sharpening a knife. The slow, rhythmic sound of the whetstone matched the rhythm of his breathing. On the other side of the room, Sayan stood by the stove, adding more water to the pot. Her dress clung to her legs, damp from her trip out onto the porch in the snow. She hadn't asked permission before going out. She had just taken the bucket and returned with it full. The others moved silently.
Kalla swept near the hearth. Tala folded a blanket. Peya checked the window for draughts alertly. Noli stood by the door with her arms crossed, as if wondering whether it was safe to go out again. Saint spoke first. "You have visitors from the village." Red didn't look up. "No," she said. "Someone is bringing you supplies. Once a month." Now he looked at her. "Not until I say so, though." She nodded slowly. That made everything clear. No one would come to check. There would be no surprises. If anything happened there, no one would find out until spring. She returned to the stove. Red noticed how she moved, pained but strong. There was tension in her shoulders, not fatigue. She wasn't a woman who needed rest. She was someone who hadn't had any in weeks, maybe even months. After breakfast, Red took a map out of the trunk next to her bed. She spread it out on the table. It was old and stained with oil and rain, and its edges were worn. She pointed to the valley below Silverbutt. "There's a trail to Carson Fork," she said. "Follow the river south. You'll find some outposts there." Sane approached. "Do you want us to leave?" He held her gaze. "I'll show you the way in case you still plan to leave." She rested her hands on the edge of the table, her fingers brushing the edge of the freshly sharpened knife. "We would have kept walking," she said, "but the youngest—" She nodded towards Tala, who was sitting by the fire, tying a rag around her foot. "She can't anymore. The wounds are older than we told you." Red looked at Tala. The cloth was stained with blood. Catching him watching her, the girl pulled her dress down, covering her legs in embarrassment. Red turned his gaze back to Sane. "I have a sund. It's not much, but it will do." Sane nodded. "We'll work to pay for it." "I didn't ask you for it." She stared at him. "I'm not offering it to you. I'm offering it to her." Red didn't argue. He took the jar and sat down on the ground next to Tala. She cringed, but he didn't touch her. He just opened the can and placed it next to her knee. "You do it," he said quietly. "Just keep it covered afterwards." Tala looked at him once, then took the jar. Paya, standing behind her on the other side of the room, watched Red. She said nothing, but a hint of relief appeared on her face. That afternoon, the cabin filled with quiet movement. Kala asked for a needle and thread. She carefully sewed the shoulder seam of Red's coat. Noli cleaned the shelves. Tala rested. Sane stayed outside most of the time. Red heard the axe striking again. She got up and went out onto the porch once, twice. She was splitting wood by the shed. Her breath came out in clouds. Her dress was soaked from kneeling in the snow. The tear in her dress at the chest was still unmended. It hung loose, revealing more than it should have. She didn't notice him watching her, or perhaps she didn't care. Red approached and placed a new log on the stump.
"That blade is too light," said Sane. She grunted, "It'll do." He handed her a heavier axe. She took it by the handle and swung it down cleanly and strongly, as someone who does this for survival rather than pride would. He nodded. "You're from White Mountain." Sane stopped, sweat already beading on her neck. He didn't answer until Forch collapsed. Her manner of speaking and bearing were neither those of tribal nobility nor of a peasant wife from the valley. Something in between. She looked at him. "You worked with the army once. They sent you here." "I didn't leave." She didn't ask why. She told Red that she had already sensed it. They finished splitting the wood and carried it inside together. That night it snowed again. Red cooked fresh rabbit that he had caught a few days earlier. He didn't use the herbs he had gathered near the shed, though. The aroma warmed them more than the fire did. After dinner, the room fell silent. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, though. Sane settled down by the fire. She stretched out her legs, bending one knee. The tear in her dress moved as she turned, revealing part of her thigh. Red noticed, but said nothing. He only looked once, then looked away. She watched him without shame or offering herself. She was just checking to see if he would look away. He didn't. Later, when the others were asleep, Sane got up and poured some water. She didn't drink it. She just stood in the doorway between the light of the fire and the shadows. "You're not like the others." Red didn't move from his seat. "I've known quiet men, and patient ones too, but most of them expect something in return sooner or later." He held her gaze, and Toussaint watched him for a moment, until her face softened. "I don't know what I expect," she said at last, "but I'm not afraid." She took a step closer, close enough for him to feel the warmth of her body. Her dress clung to her curves, her chest rising and falling evenly.
Her face was marked by travel and smoke, but there was beauty there. Not a fragile beauty, but a stubborn, hard-won one. Red didn't touch her or say anything. She lingered for a moment longer, then turned and returned to her place. He stared into the fire, unsure whether what was growing was confidence or temptation. But he no longer wanted any of them to leave, and that thought frightened him more than he would admit. The next morning, Red woke up earlier than usual. He hadn't wanted to fall asleep, but at some point the fire had gone out and he had become cold. The thick smoke lingered in the air. He sat up in the chair by the stove, stretched his neck, and scanned the cabin. They were all still there. Sane was curled up on her side, facing the embers. Paya, as always, slept near the door. Kaya had shifted in her sleep, her arms stretched out over Tala's legs as though to protect her.
Nolly was lying on her back, with her hands crossed over her chest. None of them moved. Reed sat up slowly and walked over to the stove to stoke the fire. He moved silently, but as he poured water into the pot, he heard her get up. She stood silently beside him, so close that their shoulders touched. Her voice was low. "I thought you would be gone by the time we woke up." "I don't go far." She looked at him. "You always stay on the sidelines." He didn't answer. Outside, it was still snowing. The kind of snow that doesn't stop until everything is covered. Scene poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed him one. He didn't ask permission, he just put it in her hand as if they had done it 100 times before. Reed drank his coffee and finally asked the question he had been holding back. "You mentioned that bounty hunters attacked your shelter. What happened next?" Scene took a sip. "They arrived at night. They said they were looking for 2 men who had stolen horses in the canyon. There was no evidence, just guns and alcohol." Her jaw tightened. "They hit Pia first. They claimed she had been mocking them. Then they took Nolly's bag. We had hardly any food. They took that too." Reddit looked at Nolly, who was still asleep. Her face was calm, but there was a faint bruise under her eye. "They burned everything," said Scene. "They didn't kill us. They said we were lucky. They weren't part of a tribe." She shook her head. "No tribe would take in a widow without status. And we no longer had any men to speak for us." He nodded slowly. It was something he understood better than anyone. In those lands, protection came not from the law, but from those who stood by you. After breakfast, Rit went out to check the traps. Snow covered the valley, but the sky was clearing. She followed the path to the stream. She caught a rabbit and a squirrel, enough for a stew, or perhaps a roast if they rationed it. She returned before noon. As she climbed the hill, she stopped. The cabin no longer looked the same. There was smoke coming from the chimney, as well as another column of smoke behind the shed. He quickly moved his hand towards his belt. His eyes were alert, but there was no danger. Scene had built a second fire, and the women were working calmly and in coordination around it. Nolly was boiling rags in a tin bucket. Calla was cleaning rabbit skins with a bone scraper. Taylor was wrapped in blankets by the fire. His bandaged foot was steadier than before, and he smiled slightly as he watched them. Kalia stood up when she saw Rit, but said nothing, only nodding. Meanwhile, in the background, Rit approached Sane, who was chopping wood next to the pile. "You set it up quickly," he said. "We don't want to use up your food or firewood. We plan to cook outside when the weather permits." He handed her the freshly cooked rabbit.
She looked at him in surprise. "You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to stay either," he replied. That night, they enjoyed an even better dinner. Rabbit stew with a little ground chili and quesillo. He took it out of a small bag hidden under a skirt. It was the first time they had all sat together at the table. There weren't many words, but when Noelle laughed softly at something she said in Apache, her laughter didn't sound bitter. It was soft and light. Rid felt a different kind of relief in her chest. Later, after the dishes had been washed up and the floor cleaned, Jin remained seated while the others went to sleep. She waited for Rid to return to the stove. "Are you still waiting for us to ask for more?" she said. He turned to her. "No," she replied bluntly.
Do you think that sooner or later we'll take advantage of this? That will claim your bed, your food, your life? He looked at her. I don't think so. Then what do you think? He didn't answer right away. She got up and walked over to stand in front of him. The light from the fire illuminated the scar above her lip and the exposed curve of her neck, which was revealed by the torn dress she had never repaired. I know what men see when they look at me now. I know what they want. Rid's throat closed, not with desire, but with something older and deeper. I'm not like them, he murmured. I know, she replied. That's the problem. They stood so close together that the air became thick. She raised her hand slightly and rested it on his chest. Her fingers were cold. His heart beat steadily beneath her palm. He didn't move, nor did he push her away. She leaned in slowly and kissed him. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't shy. Her mouth was warm and patient, seeking him out. When she pulled away, she didn't explain anything. She didn't apologize. She just whispered goodnight and went to her room. He remained motionless. He didn't sleep for a long time, but for the first time, he didn't guard the door. He listened to her breathing and the rise and fall of her chest, and felt that perhaps, at last, he would not be alone again. The following days passed slowly but were fulfilling. The snow eased a little. The wind was still sharp in the mornings. However, the sky opened up more and the light lasted until after dusk. This gave the cabin and its inhabitants a rhythm. Waking up, working, warming up, sleeping, and in between something quiet began to settle in. It was no longer just about survival. It was about existence. Sathine didn't mention the kiss again. Neither did Rid. But something had changed. She moved more freely now, closer and with more intention when she stood next to him, passed him tools and brushed his arm, lingering for just a moment and saying, I remember. You didn't force me. I see you. And Rid didn't pull away. He didn't talk more than usual, but every time she passed by, his eyes followed her for a moment. Every time he went out, he turned to see if she was watching him. Often she was. That morning, Rid rode to the underpass for the first time in weeks. He needed to check the traps near the Alamos forest.
He left before dawn. The others barely moved. Sane was the only one who held his gaze before he left. She didn't ask where he was going. She just held his coat while he put it on, adjusting the collar in silence. He left with the sun rising behind him, its golden light cutting through the snow. By the time he returned in the early afternoon, the cabin looked different. Smoke was still coming out of the chimney. The shed door had been patched up. The firewood was neatly stacked against the wall. Yet there was something else in the air, something in the silence. He sensed it before he saw it. Something had happened. He dismounted and scanned the yard. Then the door opened. Pia stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. We had a visitor, she said. Reed clenched his jaw. Who? A white man, in his 30s. He wore a deputy's badge, but he didn't have a horse. He said he was from the town. He didn't mention that he was passing through Wolf Hollow. He claimed to be looking for 2 stolen mules. He walked past her and into the cabin. The others were sitting inside. They all seemed calm, except for Tala, whose eyes were red. She had been crying, but not anymore. Sane stood by the window with his arms crossed. He didn't come for the mules, Sane said. He saw us among the trees. He asked us where we were from and if we had papers. Reed's voice was low. He touched them? Sane shook his head. He asked why we were there. He said that we must be under someone's authority. Did you tell him that you were our boss and that we cooked and cleaned in exchange for room and board? Did you tell him that we weren't prisoners and that he could go on his way? Reed looked at the table. A ring of melted snow marked where he had left a cup. His cup. Reed went out onto the porch and scanned the trees. Nothing moved. There were no fresh footprints on the fence. Either the wind had blown them away or someone had swept them. But the feeling wouldn't go away.
He spent the afternoon outside chopping wood and watching the hill intently. Shortly before nightfall, Sane approached. He didn't speak right away, he just leaned against the post beside him. "We should leave," he said at last. Reed didn't answer. She blinked. He could bring more men and more questions. If he was going to do it, that is. Reed answered. He wouldn't have come alone the first time. Sane crossed his arms. "Do you think we're safe here?" "I think we're safer here than out there." She fell silent for a moment. Then, Tala got nervous when he asked her name. She almost froze and started to cry. He saw that. He could see that she was scared. She lied quickly enough, but it shook her. "She's young," Reed said. "Yes, and she's been married before. She's been married before." Sane turned to him. "She's not the only one." Reed nodded. "I know." That night, the fire burned brighter than usual. Reed stayed awake near the door. Pia stayed up too, sharpening a knife. Sane sat by the window with his eyes open. No one said it, but everyone in the cabin felt it.
The outside world had seen them. They were no longer invisible, yet still no one ran away. The next morning, Red took Tala with him to the shed, just the two of them. He showed her how to adjust the door latch, set traps, and read signs in the snow, such as broken branches and footprints. He also taught her to read changes in the wind. She spoke little, but her hands stopped shaking. When they returned inside, Tala looked at Sane and gave him a slight nod. Later, while the others cleaned skins and sewed seams, Red and Sane went behind the cabin. She handed him a cup of boiled root tea. He took it. "I was wrong," she said. "About what?" "About thinking we'd be a burden if we stayed too long. They weren't." She looked at him carefully. "And now we are?" Red didn't answer right away. He leaned in slowly and carefully, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. Then, in a low voice, he said, "No." She moved closer and kissed him again. This time, it lasted longer. Neither of them turned to see if anyone was watching. This time, she didn't pull away. Afterwards, she stayed close to him, with her hand in his coat pocket and her shoulder against his arm. The two of them looked silently into the forest. By the time the snow fell again in late December, it was thicker, heavier, and wetter, covering the ground up to the waist. The cabin became a fortress, not by choice, but by necessity. For 3 days, no one went out. They had to ration the firewood, keep the goats in the shed, melt snow for water, and make their meals last, but no one complained. Inside, the women worked tirelessly. Paya built a frame next to the stove to dry wet boots. Kala boiled herbs that had been stored in bundles tied with string. Their fresh, penetrating aromas cut through the smoke. Meanwhile, Nali patched the roof from the inside with scraps of leather. Tala rested more. The wound on her foot was almost closed. She was now speaking more fluently. She wasn't saying long sentences, but she was able to ask where Rid kept the sugar, or if she could stoke the fire. Sane stayed close to Rid. They didn't share a bed yet, but they shared a rhythm. They chopped wood side by side. He would give her his coat when he saw her shivering. She brushed the snow off his back when he returned from the shed. At night, he sat closer. Their knees brushed under the table. Sometimes his hand would rest on her thigh for just a moment, like a wordless promise. On the 4th day of snowfall, the question that had been silently lingering was finally spoken aloud. It was Nali who asked it. After dinner, she stood by the table, drying her hands on her skirt and fixing her gaze on Reed. "What will happen in the spring?" The room fell silent. The pot was still steaming in the center of the table. Sane looked at him. Pia stopped tying a knot in the rope. Kala stood still. Red did not look away. "What do you want to happen?" he asked. Nali's voice did not waver.
"That man from Wolf Hollow may return. Others might too. We are 5 Apache widows living in a white man's house. Even if we haven't done anything wrong, they won't see it that way. Sain intervened. He hasn't done anything wrong. None of us have. But the law doesn't care, Pia said coldly. Reed leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. I know what the law says, he replied, and I know what the land says. No one here survives the winter unless they work together. In the spring, we'll show you how it should be done. Sain frowned. Reed looked at her, then at everyone else. I have records and papers. I could write that I've hired 5 people to work on my ranch. 5 iron hands, all legal and registered. Pia raised an eyebrow. And the town will just believe you? They don't need to, replied Reed. As long as it's written and sealed, that's enough. No one looks closely unless they're looking for trouble. Sain stared at him. You would do that? I've done worse, remember? Their eyes met. I let them in. This drew a short laugh from Nolly, followed by another from Calla. Even Pia smiled slightly. Sain didn't laugh, but she stood up, walked over to him, and kissed him in front of everyone. It wasn't a long kiss, nor was it intended to show off. It was just what was necessary. That night, when the fire had gone out and the others were asleep, Sain stayed with Reed. She didn't return to her blanket, but remained behind his chair, sliding her arms over his shoulders and resting her cheek on the back of his neck. He raised his hand and touched her forearm. Neither of them spoke. Then she moved forward and knelt between his legs. The torn suede dress clung to her damp curves. Her chest rose slowly. The open neckline was worn from work and use. Despite the cold, her skin was warm. Her thighs were marked by days of kneeling, working, and surviving. She leaned down and kissed him again. This time it was deeper. She took his hands and guided them wherever she wanted, on his hips, his waist, and his back. Reed did not rush and did not hold her roughly. His caresses were firm yet restrained. Her breathing became heavier. She settled on his lap, pressing closer, still without speaking. They made love in silence, without a bed or ceremony, just skin against skin, sharing warmth under the light of the fire, breathing in the darkness. When it was over, she remained curled up against him. Her hand lay open on his chest, and her cheek rested on his shoulder. For the first time, he held someone with both arms, not to save or protect her, but to keep her. The storm raged outside, but inside, they had created something solid. At dawn, when the snowfall stopped and light streamed through the cracks, neither of them spoke of what had happened, but the air had changed. They were no longer just enduring the winter, they were surviving together.
The first clear morning after the storm arrived, harsh and bright. Rays of light cut through the snowdrifts like blades, defining their edges. The wind had calmed. The snow surrounded the cabin, reaching chest height in places. The path to the well was buried and the roof of the shed had collapsed on one side. But inside, the warmth remained, not only from the fire, but also from something that was finally taking root. Sain woke up in Reed's room. They had parted ways in silence before dawn, before the others opened their eyes. She returned to her blanket quietly, breathing calmly, but the change was palpable. Reed didn't try to hide it, and nor did she. No one asked any questions. That was the language they now shared. Silence as respect. By mid-morning, they were outside clearing snow. Reed shoveled from the porch to the shed. Kaya broke the ice on the roof. Kaya and Nyali cleaned the corrals. Tala, with no bandage for the first time in days, limped along the path that Reed had cleared, holding a bucket in both hands. Her face was red from the cold, but she wore a discreet smile. It was Sain who noticed the footprints first. He had been removing mud from the base of the north fence post when he saw them. They were fresh and deep, but not theirs. He didn't shout. Instead, he returned to the porch and sought Reed's gaze. Rid understood his expression even before he spoke. They walked along the property line together. They found the trail near the trees. Whoever it was had come from the south, taken a wide turn, and left. They hadn't approached the cabin or called out. They had just looked. "The same man?" asked Cyan. "Could be," Rid muttered. "It could be worse." They followed the tracks to the hill before the snow began to erase them. It was too late to follow them any further. Back at the cabin, the women had gathered around the fire. Tala looked scared again. Nyali stood with her arms crossed. Kai repeatedly pressed the same piece of stitching for minutes without threading the needle. Rid came in and put his rifle on the table. If someone was watching, they didn't want to be seen. Paya spoke up. "Even so," said Cyan, crossing his arms, "they don't come from mules anymore." He looked at each of them. "You don't have to wait for me to say it. If you want to leave before spring, before things get worse, I'll help you pack and load the car. I'll even accompany you to Fort Kavanaugh." No one moved. Kaya spoke first. "Where are we going to go back to? There's no tribe waiting for us there." "Same thing," added Paya. Nyali stepped forward. "Even if we left, they would separate us again. Some would be accepted, and some would not." She gave nothing away. She simply walked over to Rid, took his hand, and intertwined 2 of her fingers with his. Rid looked at her in surprise. "I don't want to leave," she said.
He held her gaze. "Then don't." San nodded. "Me neither." The others remained silent, but they didn't need to speak. That night, Reed checked the windows again, put his rifle by the door, and sharpened the old kitchen knife he hadn't used for months. San helped bring more wood inside. Paya blocked the lower half of the fireplace in case anyone tried to choke the smoke. They weren't panicking, they were preparing. Later, when the chores were finished and the cabin was dimly lit by the fire once again, Reed sat on the edge of his bed, resting his head in his hands. He was breathing slowly, not out of fear, but because of the weight of it all. He had spent years alone in that space. Years in which his own voice and the wind creeping through the boards were the only sounds he heard. Now the room was full. 5 women, each with their own grief, their own strength, and their own way of coping. And yet they trusted him. San approached silently and knelt beside him. She rested her hand on his thigh to give him strength. "You didn't ask for this," she said softly. Reed murmured, "But you didn't run from it either." She looked at him in the light of the fire. Her hair was loose. The bruises on her skin were fading, but she looked stronger now. Her dress, still worn and torn at the chest, seemed more resilient. It no longer looked broken. It looked like armor that had withstood the test of time. San leaned in and kissed her. It was neither hurried nor given out of comfort. It was a slow, confident kiss. When they parted, he whispered, "We're staying. If they come, we resist." Reed slid his hand behind her neck, pulling her closer and resting his forehead against hers. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Outside it was snowing again, but inside they were ready not just to endure, but to reclaim what was theirs. The snow finally stopped in the 2nd week of January. What remained was hard earth and slush. The streams awoke beneath the frozen crust. Steam rose from the roof tiles in the morning sun. The light was different now, longer and brighter, pulling them towards spring. But the feeling of being watched had not gone away. Every day after the thaw, Reed walked the hill trail twice, once at dawn and once before dusk. He carried his rifle, but he never found any new tracks or broken branches, nor any signs of dragging. Who had been there that day? Either they had left, or they were hiding better now. Inside the cabin, life slowed down. Tala was now completely healthy. She no longer limped. She now helped Pia rebuild the wall of the goat pen, nailing boards without complaint. Kala kept busy baking with the little flour that remained, feeling silently proud when Reed said that it reminded him of his mother's bread, even though she rarely smiled.
Nolly, the quietest of all, had started drawing on the walls. She made small engravings. Nothing loud, just figures, symbols, and soft lines made with the tip of a knife. She never explained what they meant. No one asked her. Sand stayed closer to Reed.
They no longer avoided each other. At night, she slept in his room. Her dress was still torn, just as it had been from the beginning, but she now chose not to fix it, not because she couldn't, but because she knew he saw her as she was and never made her feel inferior. He kissed her every night, sometimes slowly, sometimes passionately, and sometimes quietly and coolly. They hadn't talked about love, but it was evident in the way they moved around each other. It was in the way she sought him out when her hands were cold, in the way he stirred her coffee before passing it to her, and in the way he sat closer when no one was looking, his knee barely brushing hers. It was Cyan who brought up the subject that the others were probably already thinking about. It was late. She had her head on Red's chest by the fire. If spring comes and the sheriff returns, what do we say? Red stroked her hair slowly. It depends on the question he asks. He'll ask if you're ours, she said bluntly, if we belong here. Red thought about it for a long moment. Then, yes. Cyan sat up, half covered by the blanket. Her warm skin, her steady eyes. All of us, she said. Her voice dropped low. Not just as workers, not just as mouths to feed. You mean it, Rid? He asked, holding her gaze. I mean it. The next morning, he took the account book out of the chest under his bed. Inside were old papers from the County Land Records Office and a faded stamp. While the others sewed and cleaned, he sat down at the table and began to write. One by one, he wrote their names. Sayan, Kayali, Payatala. He registered them as permanent residents and noted that they were family under the protection of the household. He wrote that they were under his legal guardianship, not because he claimed them as his possessions, but because it provided them with support and security. He didn't ask for permission, he just did it. When he had finished, he handed the papers to Paya. She read them, said nothing, nodded, and passed them to Calla. By nightfall, every woman had read the page with her name on it, and not one of them had packed their bags. The next day, Rid hitched up the wagon and set out on the long road to Canyon Post. It took him almost the entire day. When he returned, the papers were stamped, dated, and filed. They were legal. By sunset, they were no longer a group of strangers sharing the same roof. They were a family. That night, Cyan waited for him by the fire. She didn't speak. She simply stood up and slowly untied the knots of her dress before stepping into his arms. He held her tightly. He kissed her as if it were the first time. He touched her as if he had waited his whole life for this moment. They made love again, more slowly this time, with no fear between them. Her body was warm and full beneath his. Her mouth opened against his skin. She didn't rush him. She guided him. She let him explore her completely, never pulling away. Afterwards, when they lay entwined in the light of the fire, Cyan looked at him. Do you know what they'll call us? She asked. Red kissed her bare shoulder. Let them say it. She smiled wearily but proudly. You gave us more than a roof. You gave me more than silence, he replied. In the corner, Tala stirred in her sleep. Paya turned in her blanket. Noli snored once. Ka muttered something in Apache and rolled onto his side. The cabin, once a place of sorrow and ghosts, now felt like home, not borrowed or temporary, but real. By the end of the week, Red knew that heaven had truly arrived because nobody was talking about leaving anymore. They were already where they were meant to be. Spring did not arrive suddenly. Instead, it crept in slowly,
bringing with it the smell of damp earth, the sound of water trickling down the hill, and the quiet return of birdsong at dawn. By mid-March, the snow had almost disappeared from the valley, with patches of green peeking out from between the rocks. The blackened, weathered cabin stood firm under the open sky. The danger did not return. The stranger from Wolf Hollow never appeared again. There were no horsemen, no accusations, and no trouble. But Reed remained alert. Every morning he checked the tree line. Every afternoon he walked to the stream and back. It was not out of fear, but out of habit. Protection was not panic, it was presence. Inside the cabin, things had changed in small, permanent ways. Tala hung a mobile made of carved bone and string above the window. Kaya kept herbs drying on the stove. Noli drew new symbols every week, sometimes with charcoal and sometimes with color. Paya patched up the front porch and put a handmade bench there. Sane planted corn next to the shed, starting with one row and adding more as the soil softened. And Red smiled again. Not big, not always, but genuinely. The women had made room for him without asking him to change, and so he changed naturally, little by little. He was no longer someone who cringed when touched or watched his words like a hawk. He hadn't expected to start a family, but now he had one, and the people in town had taken note. Rumors spread at the Canyon post office. Reed Callahan had taken in 5 Apache widows. No one knew if it was out of compassion, for marriage, or for scandal. But in April, the gossip died down. When the clerk went for his routine check, he found the cabin clean, the papers in order, and the women working the land and smiling at the man who had respectfully registered their names. There was nothing to say, and no law had been broken. Only silence remained. One afternoon, under a soft orange sky, Reed came out behind the cabin where Sane was rinsing clothes in a tub. Her hands were wet and her dress clung to her hips. She looked at him over her shoulder as he approached. Then she dried herself on her skirt. "You're breathing heavily," she said. "I was carrying rocks," he replied. "You sound like an old man." "I am an old man," he said, smiling. She tilted her head and narrowed her eyes. "Not that old." He took a step closer. "I want to ask you something." She crossed her arms. "You can't ask me to leave now. It's too late for that." He shook his head. "I want you to marry me." She stared at him, still not smiling, but not looking surprised either. "This is for the law," he said. "It's not to keep others away." "No," she said, studying his face. "Then why did Red swallow?" "Because you're the strongest person I've ever met. Because when I wake up, you're the first thing I look for. When I think about what I want in 10 years' time, it's all this. You. This home. This life." Sane exhaled slowly. Her hands fell to her sides and she took a step forward, resting her forehead on his chest. He felt her fingers clinging to his shirt. "I never thought I'd belong to anyone again," she whispered. "But I'll be yours." Red kissed the top of her head. "Only if you want me to." "I do," she said, "but I won't wear white." He chuckled softly. "I didn't ask you to." "Good," she replied, "because I don't plan on changing this dress either." She stepped back and looked at him mischievously. She was still broken. He looked at her bare shoulder, the tear in her chest, and the glint of her skin in the sunlight. "I wouldn't want you in anything else," he said. 2 days later, they were married, under the fir tree behind the cabin, without a priest or an audience. Just them and the others watching. Pia stood next to Sayin with her arms crossed, but a smile on her face. Ka held the braid that Sayin had woven into her own hair. It was an Apache tradition, passed down from woman to woman. She did not carve a small symbol into the tree, a permanently joined circle. Tala brought wildflowers from the hill and laid them at their feet. Red said a single sentence, "You stay with me, and I'll stay with you." Sayin replied, "Then we stay." And that was enough. The sun warmed them, the earth embraced them, and the wind blew but took nothing away. That night, as dusk fell over Silverbot and the goats fell silent, Red sat on the porch with Sayin on his lap, her back against his chest. Inside, the others laughed, and someone, perhaps Noli, sang. A soft, unfamiliar melody. Sayin's hand rested on her belly. Reed noticed, but didn't ask yet. She turned her head. "In a few months," she said. He held her tighter. "You're scared," she said, shaking her head. "Not anymore." He looked out at the field where the corn had just started to sprout. "They won't understand," he murmured. Sayin smiled. "They don't have to." And they were silent. They were two people who had lost everything, but found the one thing that was worth more. They stayed. Love was the end. Love was home.